In this video, I'm going to describe how to take the draft straight from the book that you just gridded up and grade it up, make it larger to fit your client. In order to do that, we need to talk about the measurements that we previously took. A corset fits 2 to 3 inches smaller than the actual measurement, and that is because of the squish factor that I talked about earlier. You can imagine that if your client is quite athletically built with, low body fat, there's not much flesh to squeeze in the corset. You try lacing this corset and you hit the bone straight away and there's not much squish factor. Also, if someone is small-breasted, an A cup or maybe a B cup, whatever, there's not much squish factor here. So for the athletic build, you might make a corset that is only 2 inches around smaller because there's less flesh to push around. On larger sizes, you might make and depending on how tightly you want to lace it, you might make the corset more like 3 inches smaller for squishing in further. Another consideration is how much spread do you want to see in the lacing in the back. Some people like to have the corset meet at the back, that way they know it's laced the same every single time. Other people like to pattern so that it spreads a little more at the hip, a little more across the upper part of the back, and then less at the waist to create a line that looks like that. Depending on your taste, that's entirely up to you. This is a math worksheet for corset patterning. I've measured my client around, and my client measures 42 at the bust, 30 at the waist, and 6 inches down at the hip is 42. I want to subtract about 2 inches from that for a snug-fitting corset. So the adjusted client circumference is now 40, 28, and 40. So once we know what size the corset needs to be according to what the client needs, that adjusted client circumference, next we need to compare that to what the actual draft measures, and I've already noted that. So the bust of the draft is 33.5, the waist is 24, and the hip is 36. So the difference between the adjusted client circumference and the draft at the bust is a 6.5 inch difference. At the waist, it's a 4 inch difference, and at the hip, it's also a 4 inch difference. Now, all of these numbers are total circumference, all the way around the bust, around the hip, and around the waist. But we have half of a draft, or we have a full draft, which is half the pattern, because we'll be cutting 2 fronts, 2 side fronts, 2 of all these pieces, seaming them together to create then the full corset going all the way around. So what we need to next find is half of what we need to add to this to make it fit our client. So let's do that math. So this is the total amount that we need to add to the total circumference. Dividing that in half gives us the number that we need to enlarge the draft by, because the draft is half the corset. So that gives us, at the bust, we need to add 3¼ inches to this. We need to add 2 inches at the waist to this, and then at the hip, 2 inches as well. Again, as I discussed in taking measurements, where does the client carry their weight? Before we start applying this number evenly to all of the seams, we need to consider, are they very broad across the back and moderate or small breasted? Are they narrow across the back, and do they carry all of their bust measurement in a C or a D or a larger size cup? This is where considering your client really comes into play with your judgment about where they carry their weight. So as I said, you'll want to keep the draft for your files for future use. So what we need to do next is make a copy of this on a new fresh piece of paper that I have under here. And I've done made a waistline all the way across so I can line up these pieces on the waistline there. Now I'm going to be wanting to add to these pieces to make them larger to fit my client. So I'm going to trace off each individual piece, and then when I'm ready to trace off the next one, I'm going to slide the paper over, leaving underneath a couple inches between these two pieces, making sure that my waistline is still square on the waistline that is on the under underneath. And then I'm going to trace off the next piece and then move this over, leaving on the paper underneath a couple inches or so between the pieces, and trace them off and carry on that way. So that then we will be doing all of our additions onto the traced off piece. So for argument's sake, let's say that your client is fairly evenly balanced all the way around. So starting at the hip, we'll want to take this 2 inches and apply it evenly across all of the seams. So let's count. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 seams to which we can apply the 2 inches. So we would divide that 2 inches by 10, which gives us approximately 3/16 of an inch to be added at each seam, or each side of the seam. So you would add 3/16 here, 3/16 here, and so on at each opportunity, and that evenly distributes the amount you want to add, evenly distributes it across this half of the corset. So for the hip, once you have the additions sketched in, and remember, we're putting those additions not on your original draft, but on the copy that is underneath. Once you have that done, then on to the waist the same way. At the waist with this client, it's the same 2 inches, so it would be the same 3/16 of an inch. And remember, we're making all of these changes not on our original draft, but on the copy that is underneath. This client is a little bit larger in the bust than this is. I need to add 3 1/4 inches. Now this is where we want to apply the apex to apex bust measurement, because this seam goes up across the apex of the bust. We want to make sure that it does so on this particular client as well. And actually this client is rather full busted, so I might choose to add more to this seam and this seam than I do across the back. And that would be appropriate. That would create more space for the breast to sit in. Once you've added in the additions, expanding the hip, waist, and bust appropriately, taking into account the apex to apex measurement, you also want to consider the waist to apex measure. Now you took that waist to apex measure when the client presumably was wearing a natural kind of bra. This goes back to that squish factor. Corsets take the breast and push them up. And so you're going to want to make sure that you're measuring from the waist to the top of the corset and adding enough so that when you have your fitting, the breasts aren't popping out the top of the corset. Now, the question is there some scientific formula to gauge that squish factor? No, there is not. Bosoms are very individual. The squish factor is individual. The firmness of each bosom is individual. When I make a mock-up, I just make sure that it's 2 to 3 inches taller than the waist to apex, and then I fit that and find that line in the fitting. Once you have your corset expanded to fit your client, and the next step is the truing process. Cut out each piece and true from the waist down, smoothing out those lines, making sure that the bottom of the corset flows beautifully from one piece into the other, making the adjustments according to design, either lengthening there or bringing this up, however you do that, and then making sure walking the seams together, putting in notches where necessary, making sure that the top line flows beautifully together. You'll want to push pin these down so they don't swirl around on you, and make sure that you have notches and flowing lines so that you can stitch this together beautifully. And those are the steps going from the book to the measurements, to the draft, to tracing off the draft, and arriving at a trued pattern for your client.